This is going to be a mega review for the Xbox Ally and the Xbox Ally X. There's a big chunk here, if you take a look in the chapter link below, of benchmarks, and we're going to be comparing to a lot of different handhelds. Specifically, in direct competition, I'll be doing the Xbox Ally versus the SteamDeck, the Xbox Ally X versus the ROG Ally X, and then we're also going to be taking a look at Intel's Lunar Lake with the MSI Claw 8 in a comparison view overall, where we compare a bunch of scores together, make it a high-level overview to understand what's going on, and try to unpack for you what is the actual difference here. There's only actually one of these handhelds that I actually recommend, and when we get to the end of this, it should be self-evident why I recommend them. We're going to talk about a bunch here, so buckle up. There's a bunch to unpack here. First, let's briefly talk about specs. Now, on the Asus Xbox Ally, this has the Z2A chip, which is effectively Van Gogh. It's the same chip that's in the Steam Deck. However, the CPUs will clock up to 3.8 gigahertz, so it's about an 8% bump on clocks instead of 3.5 gigahertz. It goes to 1.8 gigahertz on GPU instead of 1.6 gigahertz, so around a 12 to 13% bump on GPU, which helps on 1080p results, but this is not a 1080p machine by any stretch of the imagination. We have 16 gigs of RAM, same as Steam Deck, 512 gigs of storage, pretty similar to other Steam Deck models. We have a 60 watt-hour battery instead of 50 watt-hour or 40 watt-hour battery that exists on the Steam Deck. For a lot of ways that you can look at this, at $600, this winds up being a super Steam Deck. It has a 1080p 120 Hz VRR display, which there are no VRR displays for the Steam Deck. There's either a 60 Hz LCD model or there's a 90 Hz OLED model. Both of those don't have VRR, but you can fix the frame rate to whatever you really want. So from that angle, there's lots to like about this, and I would almost kind of position this in a different place. Then when we take a look at the Xbox Ally X, this is using the AMD AI Z2E. So the AI cores, the NPU is available. However, there is no AI stuff that is available just yet. You will be able to use stuff like AutoSR or some type of AI stuff to like help with guides and stuff. I don't know how any of that is because it's not available just yet. And AutoSR is not all that great, so temper your expectations on what you're going to get on there. It is basically just a post process that will happen after the screen is finished. So it has to go out of the frame buffer through the entire game scene and then go to the NPU for it to spatially upscale and then go back out to your display. So you will have one frame of latency when using AutoSR. Outside of that, we have 8 CPUs instead of the 12 CPUs, so it's a cut down CPU part of AMD's latest Strix Point HX370, which is their big bad boy mobile APU, but it has 4 of those CPUs disabled, and it still has 16 CUs of that GPU that goes up to 2.9 gigahertz, which that's too much clock for what we're getting. We still only have 128 28 megabit memory interface. We'll take a look at bandwidth on the Xbox Ally X, especially compared to the ROG Ally X. So you know that that part's actually really good, but we are still limited in that space. Where that 16 CUs really helps us is at less power. There's a lot of people that have often looked at the Ally X and said, oh, Z2E is only, Z2E is only 15% better than the Z1E. That is correct at 25 and 30 watt when you're pushing a lot of power into this. At 15 watt, it's actually like 30% better. So you really have to think about where you're using this. And when we're at lower power, because we're going wide and slow on the GPU, we can go to slower clocks, still get the same performance, but spend less power inside that scope. And we really pull ahead, especially in 1080p. So there's a lot of benefits at lower power on Z2E versus the Z1E. We'll go over that in the benchmarks as well. That has 24 gigs of RAM as well. So UMA buffer size, I forgot to mention on the Xbox Ally, my default was 4. I had to change it to 6. We'll talk about my methodology for Doom the Dark Ages. We'll briefly touch on that. And the default UMA buffer size for the Xbox Ally X is 8 gigabytes. So you have 16 gigs for the system, 8 gig for the GPU. You can change that at will. It's also not a cap, it's a reserve. So if a game requires more, it will feed it more as it goes on. So that's pretty much a quick look at the specs and understanding of what is in the Xbox Ally and Xbox Ally X. I forgot to thank Asus for actually sending me these devices. I've had them for about a week and I've had to blitz through a bunch of tests. I'm barely making this review for embargo. So there are some things that I'm coming to a screeching halt on, mostly for standby testing. I really wish I could have had more time on standby testing, but I'll talk about standby briefly in just a moment. First things first, I want to talk about some of the ergonomics and new controls that we have on here. Control-wise, it's a little bit better than what we find on the ROG Ally X. not that much different. The face buttons feel a little bit better. The triggers feel better. On the ROG Ally X, is the haptic feedback on the triggers. I want to make it very clear here that the rumble triggers that you would find in an Xbox One or an Xbox Series controller are way better than the rumble triggers that are in the Xbox Ally X. Rumble triggers aren't on the Xbox Ally, they're only on the Ally X, and they're fairly weak, to be quite honest. I wasn't really a fan of it. That said, the front-facing speakers seem to be markedly improved over the original Asus Ally and Ally X, so much so that when you really pump volume on this thing, that it gets crazy loud and also vibrates the machine. It's like a secondary rumble. In concert with regular rumble, it feels pretty cool. So that's really just the sound. I don't really have much to talk about or qualify sound. It's just, I think it's excellent. Rounding out the rest of the stuff, the analog sticks, the triggers, face buttons, all that is fantastic. And the ergonomics for them, to be quite honest, I don't I don't care for this. This is too much. It almost feels like the Duke controller of handhelds. I prefer the S controller on the original Xbox, so I think they're just too meaty. I'm not the biggest fan. I actually prefer the form factor of the Asus ROG Ally X. I think that was perfect, especially because it's a lot more slim in so far as form factor, so it's a little bit easier to slip in your bag, doesn't take up as much space. This is thicker and bigger. That's just a nitpick. That's an opinion. There's no wrong answer here. It's like there's no right answer either, right? It's just my opinion that I prefer the ergonomics and form factor of the Ally X versus what's here. I think that could be kind of slimmed down a little bit. We don't need such huge handles, but that's just me. I'm sure a lot of people are going to absolutely love those juicy handles that are on there. Outside of all the controls, those are all great. The one thing that I do want to talk about is the D-pad. The D-pad is okay. If you are just going to use it for like just basic input where you're going to be mainlining the analog stick most of the time, it's actually fantastic. The type of response and tactility that you get in it is quickly understood, especially when it's in any of the cardinal directions, the immediate cardinal directions. Where it starts to trip up and fall is when you're using the D-pad for precision or anything else that you're going to be using the D-pad all the time. And what I found when using it is that in the direct cardinal directions, all that is very understood, snappy, and easy to press in. There is zero fatigue, instantaneous response, very clear and concise feedback when you press in any given direction. The problem comes in the fidelity and feedback when you're pressing in any of the diagonals. So if you wanted to play fighting games and stuff, it's not the best. So overall, I'd say the D-pad is kind of like a B ranking. It's good. It's not nearly great, and it's not nearly as good as some of the other D-pads that have been in a lot of the other handhelds that have existed. So I would like to see them tackle a different area. Honestly, I really wish they would have just used the actual Xbox Series D-pad. I love the dome-based D-pad that is on the Xbox Series, the standard Xbox Series D-pad controller. I think it's great. I know a lot of people think it's too loud and clicky, but it's just a fantastic D-pad. I am more of a dome-based D-pad main. I just enjoy all the benefits that gives me. But I digress. I would rank it a B. So that's pretty much the ergonomics and the face controls and everything. All that is great. Going on to the software side, I think this is like the bigger picture here, right? The Xbox full screen experience that comes here is front and center. And outside of the hardware really isn't all that exciting. The software is what everyone is clamoring for, and there's a bunch to talk about, and some good and some not so good. What comes with both the Xbox Ally and the Xbox Ally X is 3 months of Game Pass Premium, which is an odd choice. It's basically a $45 value that you get on either one of these models. I wonder why they went with Premium. I understand why they didn't go with Ultimate, but why not PC Game Pass? PC Game Pass is like great for what you'd get on a PC platform. Odd choice to say the least, but PC Game Pass is like $2 or $3 more. So I don't know, maybe just do 2 months of PC Game Pass versus 3 months of Game Pass Premium. I digress again. But that's what you get. It's a $45 value, and I'll take what you want. Worth noting that if you already have PC Game Pass or you have Game Pass Ultimate, it will just convert the time for you. So if it's 3 months of Game Pass Premium, it'll be like a month and a half of Game Pass Ultimate, something like that. Generally speaking, I don't know what the conversion is, but it will automatically add the correct amount of time of the $45 value inside of your subscription. So that's nice, and you don't really have to worry about like switching it or not using it. You can just add it, and it'll do the conversion for you automatically. So it's fine ultimately. That is the Game Pass side. For the Xbox full screen experience, the best start here that I love is that the controller is front and center and a main class input for Windows generally. Even when you're in the regular Windows desktop environment, holding down the Xbox Guide button will bring up an Alt tab, and that intuitively is great. I'm glad they went with this direction. There are some things that we need to talk about, but I want to kind of just still talk about the good stuff. Being able to quickly go between different applications by holding down the Xbox button and going to the different windows, pressing the X button just to quickly close the application, that works fantastic. There are some times in some games where this didn't work. So I would really love for Microsoft to really figure this part out, because it works sometimes. Sometimes it works fantastic where you press X and it immediately closes. And then sometimes you press X and it'll kind of just like hang around for a bit and you don't know what's going on. You don't know if it's closing, in the middle of closing, what's going on, what's happening. I don't really want it to second guess anything. That should be a hard line. Press X, close the application. So I'm hoping that Microsoft fixes this some way later on, where pressing X absolutely like kill -9 on that PID and just turn it off. If they can get to that point, I think that'd be fantastic. Right now, it's still pretty good. Then there's the whole Xbox Game Bar part of it. And right now, they're relying on the vendors to fill in a lot of the gaps. On the Xbox Ally and Xbox Ally X, this is all similar. You'll be very familiar if you have the previous ROG Allies. It's using Armory Crate. And Armory Crate to this day is now feature packed with pretty much everything that you can want, and highlights quick and easy options that target handheld specific features of Windows that you'd want to activate immediately. It's like some of the changes that you do for standby. We'll be talking about that in just a second. But all the things that you can do for performance, how you want to set it, fan control, tuning up the analog sticks, what you want the back paddles to be, all of that. Every feature that you could possibly want is covered inside of Armory Crate, and then quickly comes up instantaneously when you press that Xbox button. On the flip side, I think, is that Microsoft should be doing this vanilla. Like Microsoft should be looking at Armory Crate as the blueprint of what they need to do, generally speaking, across all of the different hardware, and just control it as best as possible, or start telling vendors, hey, I need to be able to hook into everything. I'm going to be hooking into it from here. This has to happen, because if you're relying on vendors, all the vendors are going to have different types of UI and UX, and that gets kind of not great as like a cohesive experience. So this is kind of a small nitpick. Everything is fine. You can do whatever you want. I just think that Microsoft should be doing this by themselves instead of relying on vendors to do it, especially if you have white box vendors like other, boutique sellers that are making handhelds. I'd rather Microsoft have something that taps into everything, and then they could just worry about making hardware, and Microsoft does the software, which they've already been doing, and that's their whole partner stuff. So that's something that I really wish that they would do. Now, the other thing that is not a fantastic experience right now is that the Xbox Guide button brings up the Xbox Game Bar, but so does the Armory Crate button. And the Armory Crate button only brings up the Game Bar without pressing the Xbox Guide button. So what winds up happening is, if you're just wanting to press the Xbox Guide button and Steam is launched and you're in the Windows desktop experience, what winds up happening is Steam because Microsoft has done nothing for years with the controller as an input class device, Valve was like, hey, we should probably do something. So Steam tries to do stuff for the Xbox Guide button automatically. That stuff now needs to be disabled. Unfortunately, that's not the case right now. So by default, it's a really messy UX experience. So when you have Steam in the Windows desktop experience, if you press the guide button, it's going to launch in the big picture mode, and you don't want that. And then if you're in a game and you press the Xbox button, it brings up the Steam input tab, but then it's also the Armory Crate tab, and like trying to get between them, if you accidentally go between them, so you have to like press the Armory Crate button, and then it's just super messy right now, and winds up that the user is going to have to go in Steam and disable a whole bunch of stuff that is the Xbox Guide functionality, and that is not immediately expressed or understood through the options in Steam. So you kind of have to hunt and peck through those options and make sure that you get all of them. So I think effectively, now that Microsoft has opted to start looking at the controller as a main class input, Valve and other vendors are now going to need to disassociate anything that they're doing with the Xbox Guide button automatically, because Microsoft has done nothing with it, but now they are. So this is like a paradigm shift, and it's going to be a messy period while all these apps kind of allow the Windows operating system to now basically have the Xbox guide button for itself as opposed to them automatically trying to intercept that command. So until we get there, that can be a little bit messy. You can fix this, but if you don't fix it right now, it's super messy. It's not a great experience. So those are pretty much like where things sit right now and so far of the Xbox full screen experience. The big part here is that what people really hope for is fixing Windows bloat. And I have good news and bad news for you. If you've already seen my video of taking a look at the Xbox full screen experience on Intel Lunar Lake on the MSI Claw AI8, we have a lot of the same experiences here. Now, Microsoft Xbox, they say that on the Xbox Ally, you save about 2 gigabytes of RAM in the Xbox full screen experience versus the Windows desktop. So Windows desktop's not loaded. A lot of other applications are not loaded. It's just what you need for the Xbox app, and that's it. And indeed, I saved 1.9 gigabytes of RAM. So basically close to that 2 gigabytes. That's awesome. So when you're saying, oh, great, we are freeing up 2 gigs of RAM, we're not running all those processes, so it should be more efficient, right? It should be better. Unfortunately, no. That was never the problem, and I tried telling people this for the longest time that wasn't the problem. But now you will have more instances of understanding why that was never the problem. It's not the problem of putting a bunch of weight on top of Windows that would slow it down. The problem is that even with the weight, it can handle those resources automatically and handle threads automatically. The problem really becomes is that you will be using way more power when you don't need to. And you can do that automatically. Like I could show you when I'm loaded in the Windows desktop and I have the Windows bloat, like I'm 2 gigabytes heavier on RAM and those processes loaded, that I can save power in the bloated state versus the unbloated state by manually doing things. So you could very quickly just do TDP on there, or like me, you could minimize clocks. You can, on the Z2E, prefer efficiency cores over the performance cores, or try and have that do automatic. Effectively, what this all means is that this is still the Xbox full screen experience, while it is usability-wise approaching the usability of SteamOS, it does not approach the efficiency of SteamOS insofar as min-maxing the most out of that chip. SteamOS, with its schedule and governor and how it handles everything on there, does a much, much better job. And this is going to be very evident when we compare the SteamDeck OLED versus the Xbox Ally, despite the fact that the Xbox Ally can go to higher power. We're going to be running at 20 watt and 15 watt and comparing that to 15 watt on the SteamDeck OLED, and you're going to see the result there. But that's going to be in the benchmarks. Again, that's in the chapter link below if you're interested. So that's the story about Windows bloat. Yes, we do free up RAM, and that is helpful in like on the Xbox Ally. We only have 16 gigs of RAM. So if you wanted to make your UMA buffer size 6 gigs, leaving 10 gigs only for system, saving 2 gigs is beneficial. That helps a bunch. That actually helps you get to that UMA buffer size, increasing it. But that doesn't make the system run better at all. We need to disassociate how much we're packing onto Windows as being the main driver of what is slowing things down or making it run inefficiently. It's just not the case. It's how it's running the system, It runs the system bad. It doesn't run it nearly as good as SteamOS. It does not handle it as good as SteamOS. And again, once we get to the benchmarks, you'll be able to see that. So that's that part. The next part I want to talk about is standby. Standby is modern standby with network disabled on all of the devices. Now that's handled mostly by Asus's side, and you can actually access a lot of that in Armoured Crate and change how you want. Asus already kind of tweaks that to the max, and they did a great job. So effectively what that means is that standby, even with modern standby, and modern standby sucks, it's not terrible on the Xbox Ally and the Xbox Ally X. And I only had a week with it, and I had to do battery life testing and everything else. So I didn't really have that much time to test standby. The general thing here is that what you're going to expect is that after some time, which I do not know yet because I disabled on mine because I want to just test standby, is that after many hours, it will go into hibernate. Idle hibernate is there. So when it's in modern standby sleep, it will eventually go into a hibernate, which means that it'll dump everything from RAM into disk so that when you power back on, it's actually fully booting back up and then loading from RAM floating from disk back into RAM and getting back into that state. So it's just really slow and not a very handheld experience. So I always disable it. So if you're just going to do standby alone, which I recommend for handhelds, effectively for every hour you will use 1 watt-hour of energy, which is good. Like it's not terrible. And that's a generality. Sometimes it'll be a bit less. I'm just saying for how much time I've tested, generally speaking, it's going to be for every hour you'll use 1 watt-hour of energy. And if you look at the 80 watt-hour battery on the Ally X versus the 60 watt-hour on the Xbox Ally, you just do the math really quick to know how long you could be in that standby state for. It'll be days. But that's to say that ARM does it significantly better. I don't know if we'll ever get to a point where x86 sleep is fixed. Modern Standby wasn't great. I preferred S3. I don't know. It's fine. It's not the best. It's just good. So that's Standby. It's better than I expected, to be honest. It's as it is right now as a default experience without me having to tweak anything. It's good enough. When we talk about battery life, generally speaking, battery life is pretty good. Now, again, I am going to show you values of me tweaking things to get the best battery life out of this device, what the system's actually capable of. So we can push both these machines down to about 4 watt, meaning that they're going to get around 6 watt in total system power. What that means is that for the Xbox Ally or the Xbox Ally X, when we compare both of them in a best case scenario, for the Xbox Ally, it's going to be almost 9 hours. And for the Xbox Ally X, it's going to be almost 13 hours of battery life. This, by default, generally won't be available to you. You will have to tweak the system, either go to silent or go to the manual and really lower down TDP as your only direct controls, because they don't really express CPU clock controls or anything else to you unless you're going to get into the nitty gritty, which I probably have to make another video about. But that's basically what you're going to get as a best case scenario. And I don't think many people are going to get that again because the Windows bloat thing really doesn't solve it. For just generally looking at them directly, if we take a look at the graph, regardless of whichever one you're going to use, because the Xbox Ally pretty much maxes out at 20 watt TDP, and on the Xbox Ally X, you're going to be around 25 watt. Because of the difference in 60 to 80 watt-hour batteries, both of them effectively have a worst case battery life of 2 hours. So that's pretty much your worst case. And that is easy to replicate. You just push power to max and then run a game and you'll basically use it. So there's no real tweaking or tuning there. You just put on your performance setting and off you go, or the turbo mode on Xbox Ally X to basically have 2 hours of battery life. And you're going to get pretty good performance there, considering the types of handhelds and the cost of handhelds today. So that's a look at battery life. Quickly talking about like thermals and fan noise. Fan noise is basically non-existent even when you push it to max. It is slightly audible even at max. Mostly it's completely fine. I don't think anyone is going to care about the fan noise at all. I don't really need to talk about it much over that. Thermals wise, you don't really feel it at all anywhere. The only thing that I will say that is a bit odd, and I don't remember seeing this on the Xbox Ally, the ROG Ally X or the ROG Ally, is that when I had my SD card in, it gets blazingly hot. And maybe I just didn't notice it, but for sure, it still gets blazingly hot, or it does get blazingly hot on the Xbox Ally and the Xbox Ally X. So do be mindful of it. Like I just had my finger there and it was hot, like super hot. And my thermal camera shows it at like 43 degrees Celsius. I think it was actually hotter than that because I mean, I could feel it and I had to remove my finger. Anyway, that's the only thing that is kind of odd thermal wise. Otherwise, everything else is just fine and dandy. And that's what it looks like. That's a quick idea of what you're going to get from fan noise and thermals on this device. And the last bit that we're going to talk about before we start getting into the benchmarks proper is the memory bandwidth. So memory bandwidth is markedly improved on the Z2E. Not only are we pushing to 8,000 megatransfers, but the memory controller does a much better job. So even when we compare the Asus ROG Ally X versus the Xbox Ally X, we have a considerable jump in performance, even though it's only like a 10% difference, right? So we're getting around 88 gigabytes per second, generally speaking, on the ROG Ally X, and we get about 110 gigabytes a second in bandwidth, realized bandwidth, on the Xbox Ally X. And that is a huge boon for us, especially because with those 16 CUs and trying to feed them as much as possible, that's where we're going to get that general 15% performance improvement because we're just memory bound basically all the time. But we get better performance at 15 watt, and we'll be able to see that more in the benches when we do 15 watt to 15 watt, as well as 20 to 20 and 25 to 25. So you'll have a more clear idea of that. So that's basically what bandwidth looks like. Outside of that, for methodology of what I'm using to like bench every one of my systems, because I'm really comparing to everything else, the Steam Deck OLED is just running Steam OS 3.8, the latest version of Steam OS, not really tweaking or tuning it outside of that. I only run that 15 watt. So it's pretty much a default setup on Steam OS 3.8 when I'm comparing for Steam Deck, the Steam Deck OLED. For every other Windows device, I try to set to 8 gigabytes of VRAM if I have the total amount of system RAM. For the Xbox Ally, it's 4 gigabytes, which is the default that it came to for me. I did have to change that for Doom the Dark Ages, which I had to bump that to 6 gig and only for that game, because when I pushed it to 1080p, it was crashing and I needed to up the UMA buffer size. By no means is the Xbox Ally a 1080p machine. You should pretty much always just run it at 720p, and that'll become self-evident when you take a look at the benchmarks. The only other thing that I do for my methodology is I disable core isolation on the Windows security side. That does help. I've just been doing that for so long, and I have previous benchmarks that I continue to do that trend so that I try to make it as one-to-one as possible. Outside of that, for the Asus RG Ally X, that is very current. That's only like a week or so old insofar as my benches that I've done on that. So all of them are the latest versions of drivers of Windows OS and everything else. I updated all the chipset drivers that AMD provides, the latest on these devices, and that is pretty much it for my methodology. So let's go ahead and get into it for the benchmarks. We'll try to get through this as fast as possible. Up first, we'll take a look at Batman Arkham Knight. This is running at 720p in max settings, and you can see that the Steam Deck OLED at 15 watt is effectively beating out everything on the Xbox Ally inside of 720p. So if we take a look at our averages, we're about 4% better on averages, but our 1 percentile and 0.2 percentile, it's kind of a wash. So the Xbox Ally, especially at 15 watt, more or less the same. It's a little bit better on SteamOS than so far as averages. When we take a look at 1 percentile and 0.2 percentile, they're effectively the same. Let's take a look at 1080p. All right, so going to 1080p, we actually start to see the difference here for the Steam Deck OLED versus the Xbox Ally. Being able to push up to 1.8 gigahertz on the GPU is showing a bit of a benefit, being able to maximize what we get out of that RAM and that frequency on the GPU. So right here, you can see that I've already grayed out this entire spot right here, which indicates the Steam Deck OLED for us, just so that's a little bit easier to see. And if we take a look, we're effectively like 10% better than the Steam Deck OLED on the Xbox Ally going at 20 watt. But when we take a look at 15 watt, it's a bit better. I would say that the 1 percentile and 0.2% are significantly better. When we look at our 10 watt result for the Xbox Ally, that is a little bit closer insofar as 1 percentile and 0.2 percentile. So this older games do get a benefit for going up to 1080p at that faster GPU frequency. Let's go ahead and take a look at our next game. This game is Blackmyth Wukong. It's low settings at 720p. We can see that we effectively need the Xbox Ally to be pushed to 20 watt to effectively match the Steam Deck OLED at 15 watt. So there will be a difference in so far as total system power between these two. However, in terms of battery life, effectively, both of them are effectively the same at 2 hours. So battery life is the same between both of them. And this is what we're looking at. It's pretty much a wash, and I only included the 10 and 15 watt in there just so you have a better idea of what's going on. Let's see what this looks like at 1080p. Apologies before, there was no upscaling on the 720p result as well. So that was 720p native. Now we're taking a look at 1080p native with no upscaling, still low settings on Blackmyth Wukong. And we're in the same type of placement and ranking. So the Xbox Ally at 20 watt has a favorable lead, but none of this is actually playable. And you can see that this is just not anywhere close to being a 1080p machine for any modern game whatsoever. In fact, when we take a look at like Batman Arkham Knight at 1080p, that game was okay insofar as being able to run at 1080p, but I don't know that it's worthwhile to do so. Anyway, that's what the results are. Let's go ahead and take a look at our next game. The next game we're going to be taking a look at is Cyberpunk 2077. This is the Steam Deck preset at 720p with no upscaling whatsoever. So this is 720p native. And this is going to be, again, on SteamOS with the Proton enhancements that they've done for Cyberpunk. There's a lot going on behind the scenes that is really helping the Steam Deck out on SteamOS here. Windows is at a big disadvantage. So you can see what 10 and 15 watt look like, and they're mostly not playable. You really do need to be pushing up to 20 watt just to make it somewhat playable, but it's still not the best experience at all. You will need to use upscaling just to make the Xbox Ally at 20 watt playable. But inside of the Steam Deck, 720p with no upscaling is actually playable with these particular settings. Let's see if anything changes when we push resolution, make it a little bit more of a challenge on the GPU and see what happens. And here are the results for Cyberpunk 2077 with the SteamDeck preset at 1080p with no upscaling. And it's at this point that it should be self-evident that SteamOS, Proton, GameScope, all of the things that they're doing to assist with making Cyberpunk run better on the Steam Deck is doing a bunch of work, is paying a lot of dividends, because if we take a look here, we can see that the 10, 15, and 20 watt results are just getting spanked by the 15 watt result on the Steam Deck OLED. We're 11% better on averages, 46% better on 1 percentile, and 75% better on 0.2 percentile. And that's more or less the case across the board. So again, this is one area where the Steam Deck is just going to trounce the Xbox Ally, but in no sense of the word would this be something that you would want to run 1080p for either one of these. These are both very much 720p machines, but I'm just including 1080p results so that we can see them. This next game is Deus Ex Mankind Divided. I am running the DirectX 11 backend with the Ultra Settings preset at 720p. Obviously, there is no upscaling. This is a late-gen DirectX 11 title, much like how Batman Arkham Knight is the late-gen Unreal Engine 3. This is another DirectX 11 title that will push DirectX 11 games to its max, and it will give you a good idea of like the cap, right? The ceiling of what is hard on DirectX 11 games and what you should expect out of these games. And basically, Steam Deck OLED and Xbox Ally play these late-gen, very hard DirectX 11 games decently. Like, you can do max settings and hit 30 FPS pretty comfortably, and that should be comfortable all the way down. Like, no matter which DirectX 11 game you're going to look at, it should only be getting better. This is going to be pretty much tops. So when we take a look at here, it's all pretty much the same. If SteamOS doesn't have anything particularly going for it, just that Vulkan conversion to the DX to DXVK, to that conversion is not really going to be doing much at all. I mean, there's a little bit of an overhead, like 3 to 5%, but overall it's basically nothing. 15 watt to 15 watt, we can see SteamOS is pretty much the same. It's 3% difference. It's 3% difference the other way for 1 percentile. Effectively, what are you trading here on their 0.2 percentile? It's a little bit lower, but I would just kind of chalk this up to whatever. Pushing a little bit more power into the Xbox Ally gives us 8%, nothing much really. So that is pretty much what we're looking at for 720p. Let's see what happens when we go to 1080p. All right, so here we are once again. It's pretty much exactly the same look. Nothing really changes. We're just lost a bunch of frames. We're basically hitting 20 FPS on average for pretty much all of them. This is completely not playable at all with these particular settings. So playing old hard DirectX 11 games at 1080p is not something that's going to be really possible on these devices. Really just trying to communicate to you what you should anticipate and what you'd expect out of them. Even though that the Xbox Ally has a 1080p screen, you really shouldn't be anticipating running 1080p anything on it, even for this 10-year-old game that will be pushing DirectX to its max. You're going to really have to go back further, maybe like 15 years, before you can start doing 1080p reasonably well with max settings. You could do this at 1080p, but you'd have to lower settings considerably just to get into a playable set, which is also just fine. But really, this is just to give you a good mindset of what you're getting into with this particular handheld. The next game to compare, we'll be looking at Doom: The Dark Ages. This is a game that always has ray tracing on. You can't disable it. This is also the low settings, and we're running at 720p, obviously with no upscaling. And all of these, even the Steam Deck OLED, which is clearly winning here at 15 watt, is still not good enough. It's not playable at all. So it will be necessary to be using upscaling. So you'll be running real hard sub resolutions of 720p. So you're gonna be going down to 360p and then upscaling to 720p just to get in a playable state. And I really would not recommend frame gen in these particular scenarios, because it's not going to be a good experience. You're going to be in a 30 to 40 FPS territory, frame genning to like 50 or 60, and it's just not going to be a great feeling. It's going to feel a lot better just to play at 30 to 40 FPS. These particular settings are not playable if you wanted to just do native, but this is really where we're going to start seeing the gap and where the divide for where the Steam Deck and likewise the Xbox Ally starts getting left behind, and we need more power to go forward for more modern games that are going to be coming out. Not to be outdone, it wasn't playable at 720p. It remains unplayable at 1080p with no upscaling. So this is, again, same settings, low. Ray tracing is obviously on. But Steam Deck OLED is winning, but winning what? We're 20% better on averages, but the difference is 12 FPS to 14.5 FPS on averages. This is all just a mess. Don't anticipate. Hopefully this what you're looking at here kind of paints a good picture for you of like where the divide is for where the Steam Deck is, and it's doing great here. Honestly, it's doing very good here on the Vulkan side, doing fantastic. But we just need a bigger GPU and more bandwidth, and we're really starting to see what games are going to start being playable for this without super severe upscaling being used. The last game we'll be taking a look at is Returnal. In this particular settings, it's low settings, the lowest settings possible, running at 720p with no upscaling. And once again, we can see that the Steam Deck OLED is actually pulling ahead reasonably well here. And our average is effectively the same at 20 watt on the Xbox Ally, but we're 20% better on our 1 percentile and 20% better on our 0.2 percentile. So a really good showing from the Steam Deck OLED here. For both of these, you really do need to be using upscaling just to get them into a playable state. So it's not that Steam Deck is really doing all that much better here. Neither of these are actually playable, but it'll give you a good idea of where the Xbox Ally sits. We'll go take a look at what 1080p at Epic settings does, but it's more just going to be informative and academic at best. And here is the last thing that we're going to be taking a look at comparing the Steam Deck OLED to the Xbox Ally. This is with Epic settings at 1080p. Again, no upscaling, so it's just 1080p native. And it is frightfully not playable. We're at 12 FPS. And again, more of the same, right? You can clearly see where 1080p is a full stop at older games. We can see where 720p is usable on games that are a few years old, but pretty much games that are coming out last year, this year. Returnal just happens to be a game that is very demanding on GPUs and will stress the GPU the most, not really hit the CPU all that much. And this is the end result for it. So that is our look at comparing the Xbox Ally versus Steam Deck directly. Let's go ahead and take a look at the Asus ROG Ally X versus the Xbox Ally X. All right, so now we're going to start comparing the Asus ROG Ally X versus the Xbox Ally X. And effectively, the difference here is the Z1E running at 7,500 megatransfers versus the Z2E, the AI Z2E, at 8,000 megatransfers. So we have a bit faster RAM, a much bigger GPU, go from 12 CU to 16 CU. So we can do more inside of less clock, which means that our power budget can do a bit more inside of that same GPU space. So there's dividends to be paid where we can get more done with less power. So let's go ahead and take a look at what's going on. So for Batman Arkham Knight, this is max setting 720p. Again, no upscaling. You can see all of the grayed out areas here. These are the Xbox Ally X. And then we have the Asus ROG Ally X here. So at 20 watt and 25 watt, you can see that there's massive diminishing returns on the Ally X. The ROG Ally X, but the Xbox Ally X at 15 watt pretty much matches 20 and 25 watt to the Asus ROG Ally X. Now, if we take a look at the 20 watt and 25 watt of the Xbox Ally X, we can see that we're 12 to 17% better at compared to the 25 watt version of the Asus ROG Ally X. So that's what it looks like for 720p. Let's take a look at what 1080p looks like. And going to our 1080p results for Batman Arkham Knight max settings, we can see that both the Xbox Ally X and also the Asus ROG Ally X do fairly well when pushed to the max. We're getting a bit better between the two on the Z1E. 25 watt to 25 watt, we're looking at 12% better. 20 watt to 20 watt, 10% better. Generally speaking, that's where you're looking at. So it's a 10 to 12% difference between the Z1E versus the Z2E. And that's from just a general outlook from Batman Arkham Knight. So let's go ahead and take a look at another game, Blackmyth, which is going to be a little bit more demanding. Next game, we're going to be looking at comparing Z1E versus Z2E on these Asus Ally X's. This is Blackmyth Wukong, so it's an Unreal Engine 5 game. We're running at the low preset, 720p, no upscaling. If we take a look at our 15 watt to 15 watt, the Ally X is almost 30% better at 15 watt. In fact, at 15 watt, the Xbox Ally X at 720p with no upscaling is playable at 30 FPS with no upscaling. So that's fairly decent, and you're going to get pretty good battery life from that result. So that's actually a pretty good result. When we start going up to 20 and 25 watt, if we compare the two, 20 watt to 20 watt, 15% better on averages, and 25 to 25 watt is 13% averages. So really at 15 watt, even at the low end, again, having wider CUs at lower frequencies means we can do more inside of that, inside the same power budget. So just much lower voltages going across a lot more CUs at lower clocks is a benefit. And we can see right here it's a 30% benefit. So that is the look at 720p. Let's bump this up to 1080p. And here we are taking a look at the 1080p results for Blackmyth Wukong Unreal Engine 5 game at low presets. When we compare 15 watt to 15 watt, we're looking at a 33% increase on the Xbox Ally X versus the ROG Ally X at 15 watts. So we have a pretty good gain at the lower end. Once you start pushing more power, 20 watt to 20 watt, it's 18% difference, and 25 to 25 is 15% difference. We get pretty playable settings at 1080p low settings here with no upscaling, so you can kind of appreciate it. Blackmyth Wukong is a weird game insofar as that playing this game, when you start doing upscaling, it gets really gnarly looking, and I just really prefer it with no upscaling whatsoever. So you could almost play this game at 25 watt. It's almost playable. I think it's going to be pretty bad overall. So I would probably suggest just doing 720p, but again, Unreal Engine 5 games are demanding, and we're going to need this latest set of handhelds, which are just barely good enough to do 720p and lower. The next game we're going to be looking at is Cyberpunk 2077. This is the SteamDeck preset at 720p with no upscaling. And we have actually pretty cleaner results here. So if we take a look at 15 watt versus 15 watt, the Xbox Ally X is about 20% better. On 20 watt, we're about 2% better on average. There's barely anything between these two. So we can see that there's effectively nothing that is a difference between the Asus ROG Ally X versus the Xbox Ally X. And at 25 watt, it's 3% better. It's effectively the same. So the ROG Ally X pretty much closes that gap pretty fast. The only benefit we get is 15 watt on the GPU side to make better use of power. But as soon as that catches up, it's kind of a wash between the two. No real benefit there. So let's go ahead and take a look at 1080p. All right, and here are the 1080p results. Now, again, we should take a look at the 15 watt for the ROG Ally X versus the Xbox Ally X. It's 26% better on 15 watt to 15 watt, 20 watt to 20 watt between the two. We actually see an 8% difference, so we're actually getting a little bit better, and a 5% difference on 25 watt to 25 watt, all in favor of the Ally X. The one thing that I do want to make a point here for Cyberpunk is that we do have P&E cores on the Z2E, and it really isn't handled very well on Windows side. So the ROG Ally X being so close to the Xbox Ally X really is kind of showing you the poor handling of the CPUs. This is something that's self-evident. If we were to take a look at Z2E on SteamDeck or SteamOS Bakelite, we would see a significant lead further for Z2E just because of how much better it handles those CPU cores. But that's just a little FYI. Anyway, these are the results that we have for Cyberpunk comparing the two systems. The next game we're going to be looking at is Deus Ex Mankind Divided. This is a DirectX 11 game, a very old DirectX 11 game, but there was no upscaling, there was no resolution scaling at the time. So it's a late-gen DirectX 11 with ultra settings, 720p, and no upscaling. They had no upscaling back then. It's just a very demanding game, and even at 25 watt on the Xbox Ally X, you can see that we're 50 FPS average and around 40 FPS on 1 percentile. This is playable. You can also do playable at 20 watt. It's also very playable at 15 watt. It's in the 30 FPS range, but I would probably say that you might be better off just doing lower settings. But you can see that these older PC games that are over like a decade old at this point, you can feel that even with the very best handhelds that we can get, generally speaking, aren't what we would expect them to be. And it's really just how the GPUs are barely good enough for what we need. I've digressed, but anyway, let's go ahead and compare 15 watt to 15 watt. On averages, again, we're 30% better on 15 watt. Having a wider GPU at the same wattage means that we can do more work because we can have less voltage, less clock. It's just better power gains. You can do more with wider GPU, and this has been the case at all times. So seeing this 15 watt result is nice, and it just gives you a better idea of if you were thinking about running this at 15 watt versus pushing more power into it. At 20 watt, it's an 8% difference. At 25 watt, it's a 10% difference. And that's basically what it comes down to. So at the higher wattages, 20 and 25 watt, it's effectively a 10% difference. At 15 watt versus 15 watt, that's where we get that 30% difference. Wider GPU, better clocks. That's where it looks better. That's what happens when we do 1080p. Here are the 1080p results for Deus Ex Mankind Divided with DX11 and the Ultra preset. If we take a look at our 15 watt, it's really not playable, but the differences between 15 watt on the ROG Ally X versus the Ally X, the Xbox Ally X, is 40%. Pretty sizable difference at 15 watt. At 20 watt, we actually start closing the gap a bit. It's 12% and 12%. So again, more or less the same. we have to push effectively 25 watt really to get into a comfortable 30 FPS to play this game at ultra settings with 30 FPS, which is kind of defeating a bit because the game looks beautiful. Like it doesn't look as good as a lot of modern games, but it still looks for those older vintage games, especially high-end DirectX 11 games, it still looks fantastic. But you feel like you should be getting a bit more, and it's honestly a shame that we don't have any upscaling technologies here because we could really be in a better place. But this is what Deus Ex Mankind Divided looks like. Let's go to our next game. All right, here is our next game. This is Doom of the Dark Ages. I'm using a low preset. Ray tracing is always on for this game, and 720p with no upscaling. So this is 720p native. Again, if we take a look at our 15-watt result, LAX, the Asus RG LAX versus the Xbox LAX, again, 26% performance increase at 15 watt to 15 watt. I wouldn't say that it's barely playable here at 15 watts, so I really wouldn't recommend that. At 20 watt on the RG LAX versus the Xbox LAX is 13%, and then 25 watt is 10%. So really that's where it shows. And I know a lot of people always felt like Z2E is only 10% better, 15% better than the Z1E. The Z2E is only 10 to 15% better than Z1E, but at lower wattages, we are actually 30% better quite often. So if you were to think about it from that angle of like just trying to maximize how much battery life you get, that's where the benefits for Z2E are, is that at the low end, they are often quite good. All right, so that out of the way, let's go ahead and take a look at 1080p. So this one is kind of fascinating. The Xbox LAX basically takes the top spot on all three, even at its lowest wattages. So if we take a look at 15 watt on the Z1E LAX, we're almost 50% better on averages, 15 watt to 15 watt at 1080p native. Now, none of these games are playable, so like 18 FPS, who cares? But it's just interesting, right? We're getting more done inside of that 1080p space significantly, 50%. At 20 watt to 20 watt, it's a 21% increase. And on 25 watt to 25 watt, it is an 18% increase. So again, stressing the GPU side of the LAX is paying a lot of dividends here, especially at the low end. We're really doing really good for the LAX. Still not super playable, but you can see where we're able to do quite a bit. Really good results regardless, but you can see we don't really care so much about CPU. We have CPU for days, and we really need to figure out a way to significantly get more out of a GPU outside of just spending a whole bunch of money. This is where we are, and that's just how things are. So we're going to look at our last game that's going to compare these two systems, and then we'll take a look at some other results. Let's take a look at 15 watt. We still have those nice gains, about 20% difference between 15 watt and 15 watt in favor of the Xbox LAX. When we go to 20 watt, not such a big deal. It's basically a 6% bonus on averages. And then if we go to 25 watt versus 25 watt, effectively 3%. It's not a whole bunch. On our 1 percentile, it's 5%. We're getting less and less gains as we push more and more power into it. And effectively, total system power wise, these are going to be pretty much identical between both of them inside of all of these TDP scopes. So that's pretty much where we are. And you can see that the Xbox LAX does a lot at the low end at 15 watt. It's great results. And it is a nice blend of getting the best performance that we can get while, it is expensive. It is expensive, but there are more expensive handhelds out there that can do a bunch more. But, if you want to pay for more performance, you got to pay for it. And this is where we sit. So that's that for 720p. Let's take a look at 1080p at Epic settings. All right, and we're going to cap this off. This is Returnal, Epic settings at 1080p and no upscaling. So 1080p native, max settings possible, no ray tracing. And if we take a look at 15 watt versus 15 watt, we don't have those same benefits that we did. We have a 12% gain, pretty much similar. Pretty fascinating. When we go up to 20 watt, a 15% gain. That's also pretty interesting. And then if we go to 25 watt, we're at 11%. So pretty much this is kind of similar across the board at these Epic settings with no ray tracing, right? So there are some things that are leaning a bit heavier on other parts of the system where the LAX is still doing effectively better. We're like 10, 15% better. So that is finishing our look of comparing the ROG LAX with Z1E to the Xbox LAX with the Z2E, and gives you a better idea of where you can get. And again, 15 watt is a great place for the Xbox LAX, so you don't really have to always push a ton of power in there trying to maximize the performance out of there. You can have a much better balance of performance while also trying to manage battery life at the same time. We're going to do some comparisons across a bunch of other stuff and combine them into a score just to make this a little bit more digestible. So we'll do that right now. All right, so this is not something I've done before. So basically, we're just taking all of the scores from 15, 20, and 25 watt, 720p, 1080p, smashing them all together and getting results. This is a combined score for each platform on Batman Arkham Knight. This is also including, you can see right over here that I'm including the MSI Claw AI8, which has Lunar Lake in there, just so you can get an idea of how this is all comparing with that as well. And you can pretty much have all the main handhelds that are in here in this particular chart. So this is Batman Arkham Knight with all my settings across different TDPs. For the SteamDeck OLED, I only have the aggregate of 15 watt results, obviously. So I don't have 10 watt in there and I don't have 20 watt in there. So you're just looking at that. For everything else, you're going to be taking a look at 15 watt or 20 watt for the Lunar Lake and 15, 20, and 25 watt for the other results and getting these scores here. So this is the combined score that we have. SteamDeck OLED is at the bottom, but effectively you can see that it's pretty much right where the Xbox Ally is. Again, effectively the same chip, but at 1080p we can push a little bit further, so that's where the difference is coming out. For the ROG Ally X, if we were to compare the Steam Deck to the Ally X with Z1E, the Ally X with Z1E is about 23% better than the Steam Deck OLED. The Claw is around 40% better than the Steam Deck OLED, and the Ally X is around 45% better than the Steam Deck OLED. Worth noting here that the MSI Claw AI8 is taking the least amount of total system power across all of these by about 3 to 4 watts on each one of them, depending whatever TP you run at. So it's always going to be saving a bunch because Lunar Lake has the memory on package. So TP includes memory on package, thus meaning that when you set 15 watt, all the externality powers, like we're looking at RAM external on all these other systems, whereas in Lunar Lake, it isn't. So Lunar Lake is doing fairly well here. Let's go ahead and take a look at Blackmyth Wukong from the combined scores. All right, here are the combined scores for Blackmyth Wukong. I do not have Steam Deck OLED in here, which just wasn't compiling for whatever reason, even though it says it was, but I digress. This is what it looks like. So the Xbox Ally, which is effectively like the Steam Deck OLED, Steam Deck OLED was a little bit better, but all these are going to be running Windows. This is what you're going to be seeing. So the Xbox Ally compared to the Ally X with Z1E, the ROG Ally X is around 20% better. The MSI Claw AI8 for the combined scores is about 43% better, and the Ally X is about 45% better, just on averages. And again, the Claw AI8 is going to be doing better here insofar as when we think about it from a total system power point of view, that the Claw AI8 is technically winning here, but the Claw AI8, the 8-inch version, is also $1,000, a little bit more expensive when I last looked at it on Best Buy. So effectively the same price, kind of a wash up for whatever you're trying to accomplish. Either one is really good. Let's go ahead and take a look at Cyberpunk. All right, so here is Cyberpunk 2077. This is the combined score across all of the different scores put together. And we can take a look at Xbox Ally being on the bottom. The Steam Deck is around 13% better on averages and 28% better on 1 percentile. And generally that's the case, right? Like Steam Deck OLED is pretty good. And if we take a look at the Steam Deck OLED versus the Ally X, again, remember Ally X, we can bump up to 20 and 25 watt. So that score is in there. So we're comparing 15 watt of 720p and 1080p versus 15, 20, and 25 watt of 720p and 1080p of Cyberpunk. So on averages, it's 13% better across that whole scope. But if we take a look at our 1 percentile, Steam Deck OLED is actually better than the ROG Ally X, which I think paints a really good picture here. Again, how well Cyberpunk runs in Linux with Proton and GameScope is just, it beats Windows up bad. So if we go ahead and continue looking at the Steam Deck OLED as our comparison for Lunar Lake, actually Lunar Lake's on top. So the Xbox Ally is our second best here. We're about 28% better than the Steam Deck OLED and 15% better on 1 percentile. And if we compare it to the Lunar Lake, we're about 30% better on Lunar Lake over the Steam Deck OLED. So is 30% better than Steam Deck OLED, which you can get for like $550. Is that worthwhile? I don't know. If Cyberpunk was one of your favorite games, when you think about it, how efficient the Steam Deck is overall, I don't know. This doesn't really paint that much of a picture of like what you actually get over it. And more or less, you can really see we are stretching, we're trying to break out of whatever we're inside of this handheld space. We just desperately need a new GPU. And it's unfortunate that Intel's Lunar Lake, the GPU is basically mostly comparable to what is in the Z2E. So we're not really getting anything better from two different competitors. They're basically similar. So it's really just a driver difference that comes in, which I would still lean more on AMD at that point. Anyway, that's Cyberpunk. Let's take a look at our next game. And the next game we'll be looking at for our combined score, this is Deus Ex Mankind Divided. And again, Steam Deck, even though I tried compiling it and it showed me the results, it would not get entered into this. So we're only going to be taking a look at just the Windows systems. Xbox Ally obviously is on the bottom. Again, across for that one is going to be 1520 watt, and then everything else is 1520 and 25 watt at 720p and 1080p. Xbox Ally across all these ranges combined, the RG Ally X on Z1E is about 15% better inside of all of those. On 1 percentile, 0.1 percentile, 0.2 percentile, we actually take a bit of a hit on the Ally X. For Lunar Lake, we're about 40% better, 38, 39% better. 1 percentile is 20% better, and 0.2 percentile is effectively the same. Ally X on Z2E is where we get like the best gains, and obviously the best. 39% better on averages. They're 24% better on 1 percentile and 27% better on 0.2 percentile. And that's the combined scores across all of them for Deus Ex Mankind Divided. That gives you an overall look of like how the Ally versus the Ally X compares. We're basically 40% better than that system. Let's take a look at Doom: The Dark Ages. Here is the results for our combined scores for Doom: The Dark Ages, Xbox Ally being on the bottom, Steam Deck OLED at 15 watt, effectively 720p and 1080p. This is SteamOS 3.8. We're looking at Steam Deck OLED being around 18% better on averages, 30% better on 1 percentile, and 41% better on 0.2 percentile. Then if we take a look at Steam Deck OLED as our baseline, the Ally X is around 6% better on averages, but it takes a hit on 1 percentile and 0.2 percentile. Steam Deck OLED versus Lunar Lake. Lunar Lake is about 30% better on averages, 21% better on 1 percentile, and 20% better on 0.2 percentile, and pretty much similar to what the Ally X is, about 30% better. And generally speaking, like across a whole bunch of wattages, 720p, 1080p, that's what we get. Even though we have pretty drastic results when we just do them directly, when we just take a look as like an overall view, like a high-level view, more or less this is how you should be looking at it. And the last game on our list that we will be looking at for our combined scores for all of these systems, we can see the Xbox Ally is on the bottom, but again, fairly close to Steam Deck and, should be, right? So a 4% difference on averages, 10% on 1 percentile, 16% on 0.2 percentile. None of those are playable, and I would argue that none of them are playable either when we take a look at them. But that gives you a good idea of like where those sit, and GPU-wise and in SteamOS and Windows-wise, I would say they paints like a really good picture of how things exist. If we compare Steam Deck OLED versus our RG Ally X with the Z1E, we're about 40% better on averages, 36% better on 1 percentile, and 26% better on 0.2 percentile. Again, a really good look at the GPU side of things. And Steam Deck versus Xbox Ally X, 56% better. And that's really, when it comes down to having effectively double the CUs, we have double the GPU and we can burst way higher on the frequency. But again, none of that really matters when we're so limited on RAM. So when we think about this, like especially for 1 percentile is like 40% better, 0.2 percentile is 32% better. And also for Lunar Lake is just killing it here. Oh, that's right. So for Lunar Lake has really good results here. You can see it's saying 82%. But one thing that is weird for Lunar Lake is that Intel drivers on Returnal, there's a lot of things that are just fairly broken. And what I mean by that is like when statues crumble on AMD, you can see every bit of the rock crumble and they kind of interact with each other. On Intel Lunar Lake, they kind of just dissolve into like a mist, and there is no physics or anything. It's just kind of bleh. And also the fog in Intel Lunar Lake is way more harsh. So even though we have much better results on Intel Lunar Lake, Returnal is kind of broken on Intel Lunar Lake, and kind of paints the picture that of what is kind of the problem with Intel is that the drivers, even though they have been improving, they can be a bit wonky, a bit hit and miss, and especially as new games come out, you may have some weirdo support between them. So that's one of the reasons why we kind of steer clear of Intel Lunar Lake, even though it is very competitive and is actually the best when we think of it from how much total system power it's using. But you do have these weirdo corner cases where things are just kind of broken and kind of not great. So if we compare the Z1E to Ally X to the Xbox Ally X, we have 12% better on averages, 2% on 1 percentile, 5% on 0.2 percentile. And generally on the GPU end, that's where we are. And I think that's more or less the case, right? When we really look at this, Xbox Ally X does very well at the low end. If at 15 watt versus 15 watt, we get that 25-30% bump. But as we push more power, those differences really start to come down a whole bunch. And generally speaking, 10 to 20% is more or less what you can expect. You're only going to get those bigger gains at lower wattages. So that pretty much covers it from comparing all these different handhelds. And hopefully I've been able to help you understand what you're getting out of this, and especially with the costs involved. Does this make sense? So let's get into that part of this review. So now that we've finished the benchmarks and talked about everything, it should be pretty much self-evident, like what I actually recommend here. And I can't recommend the Xbox Ally at all. There's no world where I can recommend this. The only weirdo case ironically, is if you installed Bazet on this or SteamOS. That is going to be somewhere where you will get that 15-ish% better performance over the Steam Deck. So it's kind of weird because basically we just kind of basically match a Steam Deck while using a bit more power. Ultimately, battery life is generally the same because we have more battery. So it's effectively a $600 Windows Steam Deck. And I don't think that that's very compelling. Now, when we take a look at the Xbox Ally X, at $1,000, the ROG Ally X, which has Z1E and has pretty much everything else, 24 gigs of RAM, 80 watt hour battery, pretty much everything the same. So it's just the Z1E versus Z2E. That's $900, and this is $1,000. So is this version 10% better, 12% better, 15% better? The answer is yes. Yes, it is. So just from a core performance improvement, yes, it is better. If you were taking a look and did not already own the ROG Ally X, and you were in the market for buying them and weren't interested in used models of the Ally X, and you wanted to, we're asking the question, is this at $100 more worth it? The answer is 100% yes. 100% yes. If you were interested in getting that much more performance, you will get that at the high end, and you'll get 30-ish% performance boost at 15 watts, so at a lower TDP, if you really wanted to maximize your battery life. So don't forget about that angle. You're not always just going to be pushing max power on this. If you want to get better power at 15 and 17 watt, this is going to offer significantly better performance at those same TDPs. So really consider where you're going to run this and how you're going to run this. But at the $1,000, especially when you take a look at Intel Lunar Lake is pretty much comparable. Now, Intel Lunar Lake does do better on total system power, but that's also $1,000. So really, it just becomes a toss-up of whatever you want to get. At the current moment, these are the best PC gaming handhelds that we can possibly get. At $1,000, this is the cost for them. When you compare them to all the other models that exist, is it 100% better than the Steam Deck? No, it's about 50% better, 45% better than the Steam Deck OLED. The Steam Deck OLED and also the Xbox Ally are showing their age, and the Xbox Ally is brand new, which is why I can't recommend it today. When you are looking at newer games that are going to be exciting, especially if you have GamePass, if you're going to have Doom the Dark Ages, any type of game that Oblivion Remastered, all these games are going to be pushing that system far too hard. Starfield, right? You have to run at super low resolution. You have to run at 720p and then sub resolutions of that to even get it running. So where does the Xbox Ally become recommendable? I can't possibly in good conscience recommend it at all. Now, if it drops in price pretty significantly, then okay, I could see that. But then you're still having a Steam Deck. At that point, why not just get a Steam Deck? Steam Deck also, during the sales, was 20% off. So you're at a considerable price difference. It's not a winning strategy there. But for the Z2E, that's where you're only going to get that performance gain at the current time. There are more performant handhelds out there, but then the price skyrockets. So this is where we exist right now. We're not going to really get to better handhelds, maybe for Intel Panther Lake next year, possibly. But then how much is that going to cost? Who knows? And then we're not going to be looking until 2027 until we get RDNA 5 and APUs and stuff. So we're pretty much looking at like a minimum of 1 year for possibly something Intel's going to do, and then 2 years for an actual GPU upgrade that is going to take us to the next level. So this is pretty much where we are. Xbox full screen experience is a good first step. There's still a lot of work that Microsoft has to do. There's a lot of work that other software companies have to do to not step on the toes of what Xbox is doing now with using a controller in Windows. So there's a bunch that still needs to happen. And we have that $45 value for Game Pass Premium, the 3 months that are on both of those handhelds. So that is my review for the Asus Xbox Ally and the Asus Xbox Ally X. This has been a pretty long video. There's a lot of detail that went into it to give you a pretty good idea of what you can expect out of these devices and where we stand. Again, I really can't recommend this one. But the Xbox Ally X, even at $1,000 comparatively to other stuff, and don't miss out on running this at 15 watt and 17 watt because there's magic there. That's pretty much it. Thank you very much to my YouTube channel members as well as my Patreon members. Your support really means the world to me, guys. I hope this video was informative. As always, guys, thank you for your time, and thanks for watching.